The cold wind howled through the streets of New York City, cutting through the throngs of people rushing to their destinations. Cars honked, pedestrians pushed past one another, and amidst it all, one man's life was about to be changed forever, though he had no idea. Marcus was just another man in the crowd, a janitor who lived an ordinary life, scraping by day after day, barely making ends meet. But today, he would unknowingly change the course of his entire future with one simple, selfless act. It all started in the most unlikely of places, a bustling sidewalk, crowded with people too busy to notice the woman who had collapsed before them. The woman, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, had fallen to the ground, her face pale and breath shallow. People simply walked past, too preoccupied with their own lives to stop and help. But Marcus, he couldn't ignore her. Something inside him snapped, and without a second thought, he rushed over to her side. His heart pounded as he knelt beside her, the noise of the city muffling everything except her labored breathing. "Mum, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. But the woman only managed a faint groan before her body went limp in his arms. Marcus looked around. No one else was stopping. He quickly realized that this was on him, and he had no choice but to act. He dialed 911 with trembling hands, his mind racing. As he did, he remembered the CPR training he had received long ago, a training he had never thought would be put to use. Without hesitation, he laid her flat on the cold pavement and began chest compressions. His hands shook, but he pushed through, focusing on one goal: saving her life. Minutes felt like hours, and the woman's pulse seemed to fade with each passing second. Just when he thought he might have lost her, he heard the faint sound of her breathing, a gasp that filled him with hope. He didn't stop. He kept going, determined to help, even as his strength faltered. Finally, the sirens blared in the distance. The paramedics arrived, taking over and quickly loading the woman into the ambulance. Marcus stood there, his heart still racing, his mind spinning. He had done what he could, but it felt surreal, just a random act of kindness in a city that rarely noticed the little guy. He didn't think much more of it. But that was the moment that changed everything. A few days later, Marcus was back at work, pushing a mop along the lobby floor of a high-rise office building. Life felt as it always did, monotonous, with no real sense of excitement. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. "Excuse me, do you work here?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see a well-dressed man, carrying an air of urgency around him. The man's face was creased with stress, his eyes darting as if in a hurry. His suit was impeccable, and his presence seemed almost out of place in this building. "Yeah, I work here," Marcus answered, surprised by the sudden attention. "I'm supposed to meet the CEO for a business deal, but I'm running late, and I'm not familiar with the building," the man said quickly. "Could you show me to the conference room?" It was a strange request, but Marcus, ever the helpful person, agreed. After all, it wasn't every day someone in a suit needed his help. They rode the elevator together in silence, Marcus simply trying to focus on his work, though the man beside him seemed on edge, muttering under his breath about business deals and millions of dollars. The tension was palpable, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder what kind of world this man lived in. When the elevator reached the top floor, Marcus led the man to the conference room. Just as they reached the door, the man turned to him, his expression softening for a moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with something akin to gratitude, but also a hint of disbelief. "You've no idea how much this means to me." Marcus nodded, unsure of what to say. "It's nothing. Just doing my job." But as the man stepped into the conference room, Marcus caught one final look at his face. Something changed. The man seemed to see him in a different light, as if Marcus had somehow become more than just a janitor. The next morning, as Marcus began his usual routine of cleaning the building, he was called into the office of Mr. Richards, the building manager. The stern-faced man sat behind a polished desk, his eyes intense and focused on a stack of papers in front of him. "Marcus, we need to talk," Mr. Richards said, his voice sharp. "You've done something extraordinary." Marcus frowned, confused. "What do you mean? You saved her," Mr. Richards said, leaning forward. "The woman you helped, she's Emma Harrison, the CEO of Harrison Enterprises." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who Emma Harrison was, but the name sounded important. "Her company is worth billions," Mr. Richards continued, "and she hasn't forgotten what you did for her. In fact, she's insisted on meeting you. She wants to personally thank you for saving her life." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He never expected this. The woman he had helped her. Stranger on the sidewalk was the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. "You're not just a janitor anymore, Marcus. You're about to meet someone who can change your life forever." That afternoon, Marcus walked into the building's lobby, his heart thudding in his chest. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside, his mind racing with questions. He had no idea what kind of life he was walking into. But one thing was certain. This meeting would change everything. As he stepped out of the elevator on the top floor, he was met by a sea of sharp-dressed executives. They stared at him like he was some kind of imposter, unfamiliar with his presence. Unsure of who he was, Emma Harrison sat at the head of the table, her gaze fixed on him. Her piercing eyes softened slightly as she saw him, and she motioned for him to approach. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. "You saved my life, and now I want to return the favor." Marcus stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. "Are you ready for your life to change?" Emma asked, a slight smile playing on her lips. And that's when everything began to spiral. Marcus could never have predicted what was about to unfold. His life, his world was about to be turned upside down in ways he never thought possible. The room felt suffocating as Marcus walked into the plush, high-rise office. He had always been surrounded by the mundane cleaning hallways, mopping floors, scraping by with nothing more than a modest paycheck. But now, standing in front of some of the most influential people in the world, he felt small, out of place. It was as if he had somehow stepped into a world he didn't belong to, a world that seemed so distant from his humble existence. Emma Harrison, the woman he had saved just days before, sat at the head of a sleek, glass-top table. The room was filled with high-powered executives, all of them staring at Marcus, their eyes filled with curiosity, suspicion, and something else he couldn't quite place. They were looking at him as if he was some sort of puzzle they couldn't solve. "Marcus," Emma's voice rang out, calm yet commanding. "You saved my life when no one else would. You acted without hesitation, without any thought of reward. And that's rare in this world." She stood up, walking towards him. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing in the tense silence of the room. "Because of what you did, I've decided to offer you something that could change everything for you. A new life, a new opportunity." Marcus's heart began to race. A new life. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I don't understand," he said, his voice thick with confusion. "I didn't do it for anything in return. I just helped." Emma smiled softly, but it was a smile laced with something more, something dangerous. "I know you didn't do it for a reward, but I believe that in this world, people who make a difference should be rewarded." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before she continued. "That's why I'm offering you a position, not just any position. I want you to be my personal assistant. You'll have access to everything, my team, my resources. You'll be a part of my inner circle." The room went still. Marcus could feel the weight of the executive's eyes on him, as if they were waiting for him to respond. The offer was outrageous, impossible even. A janitor, with no real education or experience, being offered a position at the top of one of the most powerful companies in the world. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are so many other people here who are more qualified. Why me?" Emma's gaze softened, but her eyes remained sharp, calculating. "Because you didn't hesitate when it mattered. You acted with pure intent, without thought for yourself. That's rare, and it's the kind of quality I need in my closest circle. Marcus felt his stomach churn. This was too much, too fast. The excitement, the fear, the disbelief, it all hit him at once. He was still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that he was standing here, in this room, with people who lived a life so far beyond his own. "But I'm just a janitor," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not qualified for this. I don't belong here." Emma's expression hardened, her smile fading slightly. "You saved my life, Marcus. That makes you more qualified than most people in this room. You've already proven that you can rise to the occasion." Marcus felt his heart race, but something else gnawed at him, a feeling in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't shake. This was too good to be true. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting the cold, calculating stares of the executives. They were watching him carefully, as if they were waiting for him to make the wrong move. "Take the offer," one of the executives spoke up, his voice like ice. "You won't get another chance like this. We don't have time to waste." Marcus's eyes flicked back to Emma. She was standing there, waiting, her posture confident, almost predatory. This wasn't just about saving a life, it was about something else. But what? What was she really offering him? And what would it cost him? In the end, the tension in the room grew thick. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of the executives boring into him, sensing that this was a test, one that he had no idea how to pass. He had spent his life scraping by, always overlooked, always invisible. This offer, this opportunity could change everything. He could leave behind the life of struggle and hardship. He could be someone important, but at what cost? As he stood there, the voices in his head began to clash. The pull of ambition, the desire to escape his ordinary life, the fear of being caught in something he didn't understand, it all collided in a storm of confusion. He wanted to say yes, to take the offer, to seize the chance at something better. But deep down, something told him that this wasn't a simple act of kindness. This wasn't just about saving a life. There was something else at play here. Emma was watching him closely, her eyes gleaming with an unreadable emotion. "So," she said, her voice dripping with expectation, "what's it going to be, Marcus? Will you accept my offer? Will you take the chance I'm giving you?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room was silent, waiting for his response. The weight of the decision was unbearable. Could he trust Emma? Could he trust these people? What would happen to him if he said yes? And then, just as he was about to make his choice, a phone rang, breaking the stillness of the room. Everyone turned toward the sound, and Emma's face darkened. She glanced down at her phone before answering it, her tone cold as she spoke in hushed, urgent whispers. "Keep him in the building." "I'll be right there," Emma said before hanging up abruptly. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The room shifted, the energy suddenly turning dangerous. He looked around, his senses on high alert, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What had she meant by keep him in the building? And why did her face look so tense? "Marcus," Emma said, her voice suddenly hard, "there's something you need to understand. This isn't just a job offer. It's more than that. You're about to become part of something much bigger than you think, and I need to know I can trust you." Marcus's mind raced as the room seemed to close in around him. Something was off. He could feel it. This was no longer about a life-changing opportunity. This was about survival. Before he could respond, the door behind him burst open, and a group of suited men rushed into the room. Their eyes locked onto Marcus, and he instinctively stepped back. Emma turned to him, her eyes cold and unreadable. "Stay right here," she ordered, her voice sharp. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The stakes had just gotten much higher. What was happening? And why was Emma suddenly so intent on keeping him here? The room erupted into chaos. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as the suited men closed in around him, their movement swift, deliberate. The tension in the air was suffocating, and he could feel the weight of his decision hanging over him, a dark cloud. Emma's face had hardened, her eyes now icy and unforgiving. The words she had spoken earlier echoed in his mind. In this world, kindness is the greatest currency, but it comes at a price. But Marcus didn't want to pay that price. Not anymore. Stop, he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. I didn't sign up for this. I didn't save your life to be pulled into your game. Emma stepped closer, her voice low but filled with danger. You don't get to walk away now, Marcus. Not after everything that's happened. Before he could respond, the sound of banging on the door interrupted the tense moment. Uniformed officers stormed into the room, their presence making the suited men freeze. Emma Harrison, one of the officers, barked, "You're under arrest for..." But before the officer could finish, a sudden crash shook the room. The situation was spiraling out of control, and in the chaos, Marcus could barely make sense of what was happening. Was he safe? Would he be caught up in this mess too? In the midst of the mayhem, Emma shot Marcus one last cold glance. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the commotion. The suited men lunged forward, and Marcus, caught in the whirlwind, was pulled into the confusion. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, torn between fear, guilt, and the overwhelming urge to escape. Weeks later, Marcus found himself sitting alone in a small, dimly lit room, his mind replaying the events over and over. He had walked away from the offer, but at what cost? He had avoided being part of a dangerous world, but the consequences of his decision were far from over. Would he regret his choice? Was this the price of staying true to himself? The door to the room creaked open, and a man in a suit stepped inside. Marcus's heart sank. He knew this wasn't over. Whatever came next, he had to face it. "We need to talk, Marcus," the man said, his tone cold and business-like. Marcus couldn't escape the feeling that the world he had tried to leave behind was still lurking, waiting for him to make the next move. In a world full of temptation and moral grey areas, sometimes the hardest thing to do is walk away. True strength isn't found in the rewards you receive, but in the courage to stay true to yourself, even when the stakes are high. Marcus chose the hard path. He walked away from the lure of power and wealth, choosing integrity over personal gain. And while the consequences of his decision aren't over, he can hold his head high knowing he made the right choice for himself.